I knew that of all the astronauts, that Armstrong's life story had been the least told, which was a curious thing. I mean, here he is, the most famous of the astronauts because of his being the first one to step on the moon. But in terms of his personal story, given Neil's personality, how he's been, rather I won't say reclusive at all, because he's been very active out in the world in many respects, but he has been pretty circumspect about his life and has been careful about what kinds of interviews that he gives. And so I just felt that here was a man that the world seems to know, but I kind of had this feeling that we really didn't know him very well, and that his story would be perhaps quite different than what we expected it to be. And that's exactly how it turned out. I was, of course, also very interested in the fact that he sort of identifies himself first and foremost as an engineer, and he had this background as a test pilot. And I figured with my background as a scholar, having done a lot of work on engineers and scientists who deal with issues related to flight, that I would be able to tell some aspects of Armstrong's story that other authors wouldn't feel capable or wouldn't be as interested in covering. So, I mean, it wasn't just because Neil was the first man on the moon that I was interested. I was interested in his flying the X-15 and other experimental aircraft from the mid-50s into the early 1960s. I was very interested in his combat record in Korea, and that actually, for me, was one of the most interesting parts of the book to research, both from the oral history point of view and talking to his fighter squadron mates, but just the general history of naval aviation in the Korean conflict. I became very engrossed in that, and I think readers and listeners will find that part of the book especially interesting. It wasn't an easy thing for me to persuade him to do this, and one thing I did was I sent him early on a box of books and book chapters so he could look at my scholarship and see what kind of work that I did. And I think the fact that I had written about both aeronautics and about space, I had written not only about NASA, but also the predecessor agency, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which in fact was the agency that hired Neil out of college in 1955. And I had written about test pilots, and I had written a lot about engineers. I think Neil felt that if anyone was going to really tell his story in a reliable, credible way, that it required that kind of background. I have at least 50 hours of tape-recorded interview with Armstrong. All of this was conducted in his home in suburban Cincinnati. When I was visiting with him, we would have formal interviews, but in the afternoon we might knock off and just talk more informally or go over to his golf club and play a round of golf. And so I had a lot of informal conversations with Neil as well, although I was careful about that because, you don't want to get some really good stuff that you don't have on tape. And in some cases, I've gone back and had him repeat parts of a story that he told me off tape. It's a biography, of course, but it's also an iconography. One of the reasons I was interested in telling the story is that I was pretty convinced that society, that culture, had projected a lot onto Armstrong because he was the first man, that we projected a lot of our own beliefs and values and ambitions and agendas and aspirations onto this person who had done this amazing thing, a human being stepping onto another heavenly body for the first time. And I was interested in looking at that iconography as well, as a reflection not of Armstrong but of us, in order to understand Neil for who he really is. And I think he's more amazing and more remarkable once we understand him as a three-dimensional character. But you cannot do it until you deconstruct the mythology, the legend, the iconography that surrounds him. And so it is kind of a study in hero worship and how society projects things onto people like this. And so it is an iconography as much as a biography. And that combination, to me, made the study, especially interesting.